It's a windy February day, and I think that wind, kind of see it. I'm on the little bit on the calm side here, and even over here, it's the water's got some wave action in it. But over on the other side, it's really windy and rough, and it's even still early February, and usually we start getting that wind when the days start to get a little bit longer. We start to get a change in seasons, and usually that's why they say March comes in like a lion and leaves like a lamb. Well, it's not March yet, but this is kind of the stormy kind of weather that you get just at the end of winter. Really, I guess we're still kind of more middle winter, but it's got that kind of feeling. The days are getting a little bit longer, and it's really windy and kind of chilly because of the wind. It's in the 40s, but the wind makes it feel a good bit colder than that. I was reading. I keep a book in the truck. I've had it read on it every now and then. It's a book, The Confessions of St. Augustine. It's a very famous book. St. Augustine was a very interesting person. He was a speaker during the time about, I forget how many years after. He was fairly early in Christianity, but before he was a Christian, he was a academic and speaker in North Africa, where he was from, I think Tunisia, and then he went over to Rome and taught. He was a teacher, and then he became a Christian, and he became a very influential person in early Christianity and in the early Catholic Church, because that area, I mean, that was mostly what they had. Mostly was Catholicism. There was some other areas that had that started to develop, I guess, what you would call like the Orthodox Christian religions, but things weren't well developed in that early stage, which was a good time for people to philosophize and think about Christianity, because they were still close to the time of Christ, and they were still, the world that they lived in was a lot like the world that Christ had lived in. And so you get a lot of good thinking and philosophy around that period of time that has really got muddied over the millennia, with a lot of with more dogma, I guess you would say. Back in guys like St. Augustine, they were still really thinking these things. And that's not to say there's not people today too, but everything was fresh in the world of this new religion. And so there was also a real strong connection still to like the Greek philosophies and things that you could see a lot in Christ's teachings. Like Plato particularly gets a lot of credit for he was pre-Christian, pre-Jesus, and but he spoke a lot about the monotheistic God and that sort of thing, a lot of these principles that are important to Christianity. But one of the things that St. Augustine has no problem talking about, and many philosophies talk about, and other non-Christian religions talk about this too, but a lot of us, at least here in the United States especially, Christianity seems to have a hard time with this idea that dark and light are both the creation of God. For some reason, people will acknowledge that God created everything, but then they can't seem to want to let themselves, I think it's an emotional thing, grasp the idea that good and evil, as we simplify it into being, are both the creations of God. You can't be both. I mean, if God created everything, he created everything for a reason. And I think it's not, and St. Augustine talks about this, about how like there's these varying degrees of good, and how it is a conflicting and a hard concept. He talks about it for him to rationalize. How can evil also be the creation of God? But he works through it, and he talks about how that like the dark and the light, you couldn't call something light if you didn't have dark. You wouldn't know what dark was. You wouldn't know what light is if there wasn't the two. And he kind of points it out that there's some necessity in this. That God necessitized having these opposing forces, and it's the maybe the bad things in the world that gives us direction to point our compass towards what's good, because the pain of the bad things, and some people embrace the bad for whatever reason. They should feel that understand that the pain that bad causes. People may temporarily think something maybe is good or feels good or whatever, or it's a shortcut to something or whatever. It's like telling the truth or telling a lie. There's philosophies about when telling a lie might be appropriate, like if you were in a war or a really bad situation. But if people make lying a practice just to not have to feel any kind of uncomfortableness, it eventually it adds up into just creating a bigger negative scenario. The truth is the best path, right? And you got to learn how to tell the truth, and not to lie. And if there's some information that you would be better off keeping information confidential, like saying a business negotiation, than lying about it. So just, say this is information, I will just leave, I will just hold back on this, and I will be transparent about, the situation, whatever, all the elements of the situation, and anything that, could be used against us in this business relationship or whatever, we will hold confidential rather than lie about it. People will try to take the shortcut, but if you practice consistently like that with transparency and truthfulness, the cumulative advantages of that will pay off over time. You'll have a more sustainable situation. It's the same thing with personal relationships and whatnot. So St. Augustine is pointing out that we need to be able to observe the bad. We experience the bad in order to grow, and to find, when we find that we find the light or the good, now we can appreciate the direction that we're going in. Because without the opposite, you'd kind of be like a boat without a rudder. You wouldn't know which way we were supposed to be going. But with the bad and the pain that it causes, you can adjust and say, this is not good, this is not healthy, this is not the right direction. And I can sense that because because I'm getting closer and closer to the dark, so I want to turn more and more towards the light. So it helps your compass, like the north and south. If you think of north being the good and the south being, not that there's a, or the south being the good and the north being the bad, whatever. But you need to have the other side so that you know where your compass, so you can keep getting your compass to point in the right direction. And so physics has also talked about this, and they don't talk about it in religious terms, but the universe has to have some imperfection in it in order for it to be alive and dynamic. If the universe was perfect, exactly perfect in symmetrical sense of it all, then it would become a static state, and there would be no growth, there would be no time, no sense of time. Things wouldn't change, it would be frozen. So there has to have these imperfections and things to adjust ourselves by. So it's not, you don't have, just because maybe religion has a problem with it, or a lot of times religion has adjusted towards what makes it easiest for them to speak to. They don't want to create conflict in the church. So if it's easier for the church to say that, or whatever, or people in the church to say that evil is evil, and God has nothing to do with evil, and then makes everything easier to go, it doesn't create any difficulties in the church, then sometimes that's the kind of the weakness of mass thinking, But you have, if everything is all God's creation, then everything is God's creation. You can't make exceptions, and and it's not a scary thing to realize that, if you can understand that all that pain and suffering and everything comes from when we sin, and when we from what is evil. And in the more of the agrarian people, when they talk about stuff like that too, they were really interesting, because they even talked about how, because they lived in the wild, they didn't have modern medicine and all this stuff, how even in their minds, and they're talking, and they'll think about the evil in nature, not necessarily because they thought animals were bad or anything like that, but because if they got bit by a snake, it's bad to get bit by a poisonous snake today, but back then they didn't have antidotes and anti-venom and all that stuff. So, for example, to them, that was the best way to explain that was the evil in the snake. They weren't necessarily saying the snake was evil, but the snake bite was bad because it was taking life away from them. Again, don't conflate that with snakes being bad. They're part of nature, but that's the point. They're God's creation. And that venom in the snake, at most of the time, allows that snake's defense and its ability to help it catch and eat prey, which by then in the holistic sense of nature helps to keep a balance in the environment that it lives in. By the snake eats rodents and things like that, and you don't want an overpopulation of rodents. You want a balance, or those sorts of things, because things get out of whack in nature, and so that's all a part of a balance. And just because, so there's good in that. It's just you don't want to get bit by the snake and it can get poisoned. So it's all part of a balance in nature, and you have to say that maybe another way to think about evil or bad things is not so much that the thing itself is bad or evil. It's the way that you interact with it that's bad or evil, right? So there might be lots of things that in their pure sense are good and part of the universe and pushing the people and society and the world and everything forward, as in keeping things alive. But then if we interact with it or use it in the wrong way, that's really where the bad or the evil comes from. And that then informs us, and we should not necessarily have to learn all of these things through experience. We need to, pass these lessons on to other people and other generations so that they know to avoid these things and not just have to experience all of them. And that's part of what, teachings of the Bible and other rules and things are supposed to do at lots of different levels. They can be even things in like, doesn't seem like good or evil belongs in, say, mathematics, but it's still kind of a similar concept, right? Like you want to teach people the right way to do math and things like that. I'm taking a little bit, but like you wouldn't want to, you got to teach people things. You got to pass knowledge along. You can't expect every generation to relearn everything. And, it took a long time for somebody to discover calculus, for example. You can't expect that if you don't teach calculus that somebody's just going to come along and think it up again. It might take another 500 years. That's the point of passing knowledge along. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Pass knowledge along in the appropriate way, in the teachings of good and bad and the right way to do things and inferior ways to do things. And as St. Augustine kind of talks about it, it's in layers. A lot of times we want to say good and bad or good and evil are just complete opposites, but he makes the point that it's a scale. There's layers of this, right? Like there's things that are just horrendously bad, but then there's maybe some things that just seem like perfectly good, but they're pretty rare, those extremes. Most of the things in our lives are sort of this mix and everything. And that's why we need that compass. So that compass is kind of guiding us through our day-to-day activities, which are a mix of all of these things, and so that we try to get the best direction on any particular situation. And it also helps us to keep us sane, because we have to know that we're living in this imperfect world, this perfectly imperfect world. Now, that's another rule, perfectly imperfect, meaning that there's sort of this idea that perfection just means 2 + 2 = 4 and everything's balanced all the time. But since we know that the world isn't that way, then we have to think that God created a perfect world on the whole by putting what we view as imperfections in it on the small scale. So on the small scale, things have these imperfections, these good, the bad, the good, the evil. But on the whole, the really big scale, that was part of the perfection of the creation. So you don't have to be scared of this concept or that there's just this black and this white and everything, because it'll make it hard to understand life if you try to just view it that way. Now you can view it that way on a practical level, like when you come into a situation, you can say, this is bad, this is good, I'm going to choose the good over the bad. That's a practical application in one specific scenario. But when you're thinking about life as a whole, your life and everybody's life, this whole world is just a mix of all these different things happening, and that's where the people talk about God's plan and these kinds of things. But think about it also as informing your compass. That's how you sense the right direction to go in. That's how it's a sense. We don't talk about it as part of like the touch, taste, hearing, that kind of thing, but it's still a sense. It's a cognitive sense, and you have to develop it. I love you.